James Cameron, the iconic filmmaker behind Titanic and Avatar, once owned a beautiful mansion nestled in the hills of Los Angeles. The house, built in the 1920s, had a unique architectural charm with its sprawling hallways and panoramic windows overlooking the city. But for all its beauty, the house harbored unsettling secrets that Cameron himself could never explain. During his years in the house, Cameron frequently experienced odd occurrences. He would place his scripts and sketches on the desk in his study, only to find them shuffled or inexplicably moved by morning. Initially attributing this to his own forgetfulness or drafts of air, he thought little of it. But as the events grew more pronounced, it became harder to dismiss. One night, while working on a particularly demanding scene for The Abyss, Cameron felt a sharp chill pass through the room. Moments later, a stack of papers flew off his desk, scattering across the floor. The windows were closed, and no logical explanation presented itself. The most chilling moments, however, came at night. Cameron would often wake abruptly to a whisper so close it felt as though someone was speaking directly into his ear. The whispers were unintelligible but carried an unmistakable urgency. Cameron once invited a close friend to stay overnight to verify his experiences. The friend, a staunch skeptic, woke up pale and shaken, claiming to have heard the same whispers and felt a presence in the room. Rumors began circulating among staff and visitors. Some claimed the house was built over a long-forgotten burial ground, while others suggested it had been cursed by its original owner, a recluse with a tragic past. Though Cameron has never publicly acknowledged the events, he quietly sold the house a few years later, moving to a more modern residence. The current owners have reported similar occurrences, perpetuating the eerie reputation of James Cameron's former home. In the months leading up to his decision to sell, the disturbances became increasingly personal. Objects weren't just moving, they were disappearing altogether. A favorite pen Cameron used for drafting storyboards would vanish from his desk and reappear days later in a completely different room. Once, he found it balanced precariously on the edge of his bathtub, a place he hadn't even entered in weeks. The whispers also began to take on a strange, almost rhythmic quality. Cameron described it later to a confidant as sounding like waves crashing, but with an unsettling human tone, as though the house itself were speaking. The most unnerving part was that they always came at the same time, 3:07 a.m. Driven by a mix of frustration and curiosity, Cameron decided to set up cameras around the house. He hoped to catch anything that could explain the disturbances. For days, the footage showed nothing out of the ordinary. But then, one night, as he reviewed the recordings, his heart stopped. On the tape from the camera in his study, a shadow passed across the room. It wasn't a fleeting blur but a defined shape, tall and humanoid, moving with purpose. It paused briefly at the desk, as if inspecting Cameron's work, before vanishing into the wall. The recordings also captured faint, distorted sounds that seemed to align with the whispers he heard at night. But when Cameron tried to analyze the audio, the files corrupted every time, leaving behind only fragments of unintelligible static. One night, as Cameron sat reviewing his notes for Terminator 2, he felt the atmosphere in the room change. The air grew thick, and the sound of faint, wet footsteps echoed through the hall. Before he could investigate, his office door creaked open on its own. "Who's there?" he called, his voice betraying a rare tremor. There was no response, only a low, drawn-out sigh that seemed to come from right behind him. Spinning around, Cameron saw nothing but his reflection in the window. Yet, as he stared, he noticed something horrifying. A second silhouette standing just over his shoulder. After months of unsettling events, James Cameron finally made the decision to sell the house. Despite the strange occurrences, he was reluctant to leave the place, but the growing unease became too much to ignore. He moved out, but not without a lingering sense that something in that house had marked him. The new owners were a young couple, eager to start a new chapter in their lives. They were unaware of the house's eerie history, and the moment they laid eyes on it, they fell in love with its old-world charm. The large windows, the sweeping views of Los Angeles, and the sprawling garden seemed like the perfect place to settle down. But from the moment they moved in, they began to notice strange things too. At first, it was small things out of place. The kind of disorganization one could chalk up to a busy move-in. But then the noises started. The whispers in the night. They would wake up to the sound of their names being called softly from the hallway, though neither of them had spoken. On one occasion, the husband swore he saw a figure standing at the foot of their bed, a tall silhouette with no discernible features, before it faded into the walls. The wife, a former skeptic, became unnerved when she found a strange, handwritten note on their kitchen counter. It was written in a hurried, slanted hand, "It's not over." It never was. The couple was confused. Neither of them had written it, and there were no signs of intrusion. As the weeks passed, the house grew more oppressive. The wife started experiencing vivid dreams, each one darker and more cryptic than the last. In one, she stood in the study, surrounded by piles of old scripts. The room seemed to shift around her as the shadows took on a life of their own. And then the whispers returned, louder this time, as a cold hand brushed the back of her neck. But the most chilling event occurred one afternoon when the husband returned home to find the front door wide open. He had locked it before leaving, and the entire house was eerily silent. He walked in, calling out for his wife, but no response came. When he reached the living room, his blood ran cold. The wife was standing there, staring at the wall with a glazed expression, her hands raised as though holding something invisible. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated. When he approached, she slowly turned to him and spoke, her voice strange and distant. "The house is watching us. It knows we're here." Terrified, he tried to snap her out of it, but she didn't respond. It was as though she were in a trance, caught between the waking world and something else. Desperate for answers, the couple reached out to a paranormal investigator. What they uncovered sent chills down their spines. The house had a long history of strange occurrences, far predating Cameron's time there. It had once been the home of a reclusive artist who had vanished mysteriously. Local legend claimed that the artist had conducted occult rituals in the very room where Cameron had experienced his most intense disturbances. The investigator confirmed that the whispers and figures the couple saw weren't just residual hauntings, they were manifestations tied to something darker, a presence that had been awakened. The house, it seemed, had its own secrets, and it was no longer content to remain silent. The couple, now deeply unsettled, started researching the house's past, uncovering layers of mystery tied to its previous owners. Each one had experienced similar strange events, but no one had ever stayed long enough to discover the truth. The house seemed to claim its residents, drawing them in with promises of grandeur before revealing its true, sinister nature. It became clear that Cameron's decision to leave was no mere coincidence. The house had claimed him just as it had others before him. And now, the new owners were trapped in its grip, unsure of what would happen next or who would be the house's next victim. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the house grew more oppressive. The new owners, once hopeful about their fresh start, now found themselves living in a constant state of unease. The wife began to feel as though the house itself were changing around them, warping and shifting in subtle, terrifying ways. The furniture seemed to move when they weren't looking, shifting just slightly enough that they couldn't be sure it hadn't been that way before. One night, they decided to hold a dinner party, inviting a few close friends over in an attempt to distract themselves from the growing tension. As the evening wore on, the conversation drifted to the history of the house. A guest, an older woman who had lived in the area for decades, casually mentioned that she'd heard rumors about the house's previous occupants. She spoke of the reclusive artist who had once lived there, claiming he had become obsessed with his work to the point of madness. He used to talk about seeing things in the walls, the woman said with a shrug, as if it were no big deal. Some said he painted them visions, I suppose. The paintings were supposed to be alive. At that moment, the room seemed to grow colder. The wife felt a sudden, strange pull, as if her gaze were drawn to the far wall. There, behind the bookshelves, something was faintly visible through the plaster lines, almost like scratches or carvings. She excused herself and moved toward the wall, heart racing. She reached out to touch the surface, and a cold, sharp shiver ran through her fingers. When she pressed harder, the wall gave way, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, she found a weathered painting, its edges frayed and stained with age. The painting depicted a figure standing alone in the center of the room they were now in. The figure was tall, gaunt, and cloaked in shadows, with no visible features except for two glowing eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. As she stared at the painting, a soft whisper filled her ears. "You shouldn't have found that." She spun around, but no one was behind her. Her pulse hammered in her throat. The rest of the guests had continued their conversation, oblivious to the tension building in the room. But the wife couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Later that night, as the party wrapped up, the wife couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. That's when the whispers came again, closer this time, almost right next to her ear. But it wasn't the same as before. These whispers were sharp, desperate, angry. The voice seemed to say, "Leave, before it's too late." Suddenly, the wife felt the mattress shift beneath her, the weight of something pressing down on the bed, as if an invisible figure had just settled next to her. She felt the air around her grow heavier, suffocating, and then bang, the door to their bedroom slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Terrified, she rushed to wake her husband, but when she turned to him, she froze. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were wide open, but his expression was blank, empty, as if he were no longer fully present. And then, in a voice that was not his own, he whispered, "It's waiting for you." Panic surged through her, and she tried to shake him awake, but his body felt cold, rigid. The voice, still not his own, continued to speak. "You shouldn't have stayed. You are part of it now." Frantic, she jumped out of bed, her heart hammering in her chest. She rushed toward the door, only to find it locked from the inside. The whispers were now accompanied by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. With no way out, she turned to the only thing left that might hold answers: the painting. Her hands trembled as she lifted it from the hidden compartment and studied it once more. The eyes of the figure seemed to burn into her soul. She felt a strange compulsion to speak aloud. "What do you want?" To her shock, the eyes seemed to flash. Then, with an almost imperceptible tremor, the painting moved on its own, sliding off the wall and crashing to the floor. The figure in the painting shifted. In the blink of an eye, it was no longer confined to the canvas. The figure stood in front of her, its shadow stretching across the room, eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It opened its mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she felt the words vibrating deep within her mind. "You are here to complete the cycle." Suddenly, she felt herself pulled toward it, her body moving against her will. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Her vision blurred, and she was overwhelmed by a sense of vertigo, as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling. In that moment, she realized something horrifying. The house didn't want them to leave. It needed them to stay. And they were not the first to be caught in its trap. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The wife's world twisted into a nightmare. The figure in the painting stood before her, its form indistinct, like a shadow given flesh. Its presence was suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. She could barely breathe, her chest tightening as the figure's eyes, those glowing, malevolent eyes, stared deep into her soul. The room around her seemed to distort, the furniture warping and bending, the air thick with an electric hum. It felt as if time itself had fractured. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the crushing silence that followed the figure's whispered words. She felt a pull inside her, an ancient force, buried deep within the walls, reaching out and drawing her closer. Then, she saw something that made her heart stop. The figure's eyes didn't just glow, they burned. And as the burning light intensified, the walls of the room seemed to ripple, revealing strange symbols carved deep into the plaster, as though they were always there but hidden from sight. The symbols, ancient and undecipherable, shimmered like fire, flickering and shifting as if alive. It has always been waiting for you. The figure's voice, now audible but distorted, echoed in her mind, cold and distant. Its words cut through her consciousness like a blade. You are not the first, but you will finish what was started. The wife stumbled back, shaking uncontrollably, her mind racing. What did it mean? What had been started? She turned to her husband, desperate to wake him, but he was no longer himself. His eyes were vacant, empty, as if he were just another shell. His body remained frozen, yet his lips parted and muttered in that same foreign voice, "The door is open. You must walk through." With a surge of terror, she grabbed his arm, shaking him harder, but his body remained cold, lifeless. He was no longer the man she knew. There was only an echo of him, trapped inside a vessel, being used to channel something far more sinister. The whispering came again, now louder and more insistent. From the shadows, from the very corners of the room, she felt unseen eyes watching her, waiting for her to make a choice. "You can't leave," the voice said, growing more frantic. "You belong here now. You are part of the house." The walls groaned as though in agreement, the house itself breathing, alive, its very foundation shifting. Then the door, still locked, suddenly flew open with a violent crash. But the hallway beyond wasn't what she expected. It was darker, longer, the shadows stretching unnaturally far, as if the house had somehow grown larger in the blink of an eye. A hallway, deep and endless, led into nothing but a swirling mist that seemed to beckon her forward. Compelled by an unseen force, she stepped toward it, her legs moving against her will. The air in the hallway was thick and cold, every step echoing louder than the last. Her heart hammered in her chest. But just as she was about to cross the threshold, something in the back of her mind screamed a warning, a sense of realization. She knew this place. She knew this hall. It was the same one from the painting, the very hallway she had walked down in her dreams. She stopped, paralyzed. She had been here before. "Not yet," the voice urged, now softer but filled with a terrible finality. "You haven't earned it. Not yet." She turned, trying to shake off the compulsion. But the hallway had already begun to close in, the walls stretching, the mist thickening into something tangible. She could see figures, now shadows, flickering in the mist, just beyond the edge of her vision. Each one was distinct. An old man with a crooked back, a woman in tattered clothing, a child with hollow eyes. All of them trapped, she realized. Then, a voice broke through, sharp and clear, cutting through the fog. "You can't go back." It was her husband's voice, but distorted, as if from somewhere deep within the mist. Desperately, she tried to turn and run, but the hallway seemed endless, stretching farther than any human eye should see. The walls closed in on her, the whispers now a deafening roar. She felt herself drawn deeper into the house, into its heart. But before she could move, a new figure appeared at the end of the hallway, a figure she recognized, but not as she knew him. He stood tall, his eyes cold and empty, his face pale as though drained of all emotion. His clothes were ragged, worn as though he had been wandering this endless hall for years. His expression was vacant, lost. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said softly, his voice hollow. "None of us should have stayed." The wife's breath caught in her throat. Presence was the final confirmation. He had been a prisoner of this house, just like her, trapped in the cycle of its dark influence. But what had brought him here? What had kept him here? The walls closed in tighter, and the whispering grew louder, more frantic. There was no escape. The house was closing its grip, pulling her into its depths, where no one could hear her scream. The wife, now completely overwhelmed, stood frozen before the ghostly figure. The walls seemed to pulse, closing in on her with each heartbeat. The whispers, the shadows, the figures from the painting, all were closing in, and she realized with a sickening certainty that the house was never meant to be escaped. It claimed its victims, and they were all part of the cycle. The figure in front of her wasn't. It was something darker, older. It had a face twisted in anguish, its features shifting between shapes, as if the house had somehow summoned all of its tortured souls into one form. The expression was one of loss and desperation, eyes wide with fear. "You shouldn't have stayed," the figure whispered, its voice fragmented and hollow, like a chorus of voices trapped together. "None of us should have stayed." The wife's heart raced as the house seemed to tighten its grip on her, the temperature dropping with every breath she took. She tried to back away, but the walls seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The whispering voices grew louder, and she could hear her husband's voice distorted and foreign coming from behind her. "You can't leave, we can't leave." The figure before her shifted again, now taking on the face of someone she didn't recognize, someone from the house's past. It flickered between forms, each one a tortured soul who had once lived and died there. The wife understood now. The house didn't just hold spirits, it consumed them, collecting their memories and turning them into its eternal prisoners. The figure stepped closer, and the wife could feel the coldness of its presence as if it were pulling her toward it. "It feeds on regret," it whispered, "on fear, and it doesn't let go." In that moment, she understood the true nature of the house. It wasn't haunted by just one spirit, it was haunted by them all. The souls who had been trapped in its walls, lost in its cycles. The house didn't just claim them. It erased them, folding their lives into its dark history. As the figure reached out toward her, she realized there was no escape. She was already part of the house's history, another soul to be absorbed into its endless nightmare. Her last thought, as she took a step toward the figure, was a painful realization. She would never leave, and neither would anyone else who dared enter the house. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.